Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
It's still October, so that means it's time to talk about vampires that have nothing to do with the ungodly Twilight franchise. The vampire subgenre is one of the oldest and most successful subgenres in not just horror history, but cinematic history. All the way from Nosferatu to Dracula, and yes, even to that glittery little skid mark, Edward. And don't try to explain the glitteriness. Don't give me the, well, you see, Twilight takes place in Seattle, so it's cloudy, and so that's why. Bullshit. Dude was jealous of Mariah Carey, but the author's traditional Mormon lifestyle informed Edward that that was a sin, so he decided to waste an eternity pouting in the goddamn rain until a smelly girl decided she didn't love herself. And if that sounds boring and angsty to you, you're right, it is. That's why they had to bring in a werewolf that doesn't love himself either. So there, that's what really happened, and that's your cliff notes for the Twilight franchise. But anyway, back to movies that actually matter. The success of vampires in cinema means that there's a ton of movies to choose from here, and the quality of these movies are definitely better than my previous video on werewolves, even though I do think werewolves are way more interesting and swell. In fact, I have a bit of a love-hate stance on vampire movies in general. I love when they are funny or scary, but I always hate the fact that sensuality tends to be front and center. A lot of times you'll see that filmmakers just don't seem to realize that vampire movies don't actually have to have really, really ridiculously good-looking actors and actresses saying, "Hey everyone, come see how good I look." Of course, there are exceptions to the rule, such as Salma Hayek, Angie Everhart, Jennifer Esposito, women that I find hot, basically. But there are a few undeniably sexy vampires that will show up on this list. Okay, let's stop the chit-chat and count down my top 15 favorite vampire movies. We begin with Twilight. I'm kidding, that's just the obvious gag here, but obviously I'm not going to save pictures from that movie on my laptop and make a graphic out of them. So here we start the list off with Dr. Sleep instead. And am I kind of cheating on this one? I mean, Dr. Sleep is the sequel to The Shining, and The Shining is very much not a vampire movie. And the creepy clan in this movie doesn't feature traditional vampires either. But they definitely are vampires. It's just that they feed on psychic energy rather than, blood. So the question is, should that even really count? Well, it's my list and I say yep. And this is a really good movie. That would be higher on the list if I was just ranking the movies by themselves, or especially if I was judging by quality. But this isn't a list based on quality, this is a list on vampire movies, and since this isn't wholly a vampire movie, I couldn't rank it any higher. I mean, this movie has so much other stuff going on. There's the Overlook Hotel, there's psychic powers, alcoholism, creepy twins, soggy scabbed naked woman, a ghost that isn't Jack Nicholson but is supposed to be Jack Nicholson. He's a dude disguised as another dude that's playing the ghost of the other dude. And by the way, if you couldn't get Jack Nicholson for that role, then just cast Jack Black. That would have been way less distracting. Anyways, Dr. Sleep is a unique film in that it's actually kind of a marriage between three properties that don't particularly seem to like one another, meaning Kubrick's movie and the two novels by King. But it does bring the three properties together effectively overall. At 14, we travel all the way back to the year 1991 for Full Moon's Subspecies, which would actually end up launching a straight-to-video franchise. There would be 4 movies released between 1991 and 1998, and I'd really only probably recommend the first 2. But this was probably my favorite vampire franchise as a kid, so nostalgia obviously plays a role on its ranking. But it's only partly nostalgia because there are legitimately some really good ideas and a decent story to be found here, despite the noticeably small budget. For instance, the concept of the Bloodstone is great, as is the family dynamics between the evil Radu and the rest of his family. His mother scared the shit out of me for some reason back in the day. And seriously, Radu, when even your vampire family banishes you, it may be time to start doing some self-reflection, buddy. One other thing that this movie does have going for it is that it is actually filmed in Romania. In fact, this appears to have been the very first American film to be shot there after communism fell in the region. At number 13 is John Carpenter's Vampires, released in 1998. It stars conservative edgelord and man who looks at the swastika as the beginning of an innocent maze, James Woods. It also stars one of the other Baldwin brothers, no, not the one from Biodome, no, not Flatliners either. And also Cheryl Lee is a prostitute who has only recently been turned by the head vampire that Woods and his team of vampire hunters is trying to track down. First off, Woods is a total asshole. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that he's also probably a pervert, and social media would be a better place if he would just forget all of his passwords, which you just know has the word titties in it and a birth date that is way too recent to be his. But he's fine here. Maybe even better than in anything that I've ever seen him in. I don't know. Maybe it's because his character's name in this movie is Jack Crow, and he was such a big fan of Jim Crow that he was able to really dial in here. Gene Siskel even surprisingly loved this film, and actually said, I don't think he was trying to be ironic either, that James Woods should get an Oscar nomination for his performance in this movie. Still, that would have been a bit silly, but it's a really good, fun vampire flick, and it actually is just as much of an action/western movie as it is a horror movie. Number 12 is the Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino 1998 hit From Dusk Till Dawn, which likes just a little vampire action between its gun violence, kidnapping, and sexy tabletop dancing. From Dusk Till Dawn boasts a loaded cast that includes George Clooney, Juliette Lewis, Harvey Keitel, Tarantino himself, Cheech Marin, Danny Trejo, and effects legend Tom Savini and his pistol penis. If you've seen this movie, then you know what I mean. By the way, if you like the pics that I selected for this little collage, I think I should get bonus points. Why? Because I very easily could have just used 5 different shots of Salma Hayek, and I would have been mathematically 4 times as happy. As the youths, and also the dirty sluts on social media say these days, she can get it. Ironically, Hayek almost didn't accept this role because it required her to dance with a boa constrictor and she was deathly afraid of snakes. But when they lied and told her that Madonna really wanted the role, she apparently rushed to get 2 months of therapy to overcome her fear, and yet 2 years of therapy didn't do anything to overcome my fear of swirly straws. Hey, did you all know that Loki did a vampire movie? Yeah, neither did I. Not until very recently, at least. Only Lovers Left Alive was released in 2013, and I don't recall it getting much hype, or maybe I just slept through it, I don't know. At any rate, it just barely misses out on the top 10 here, and it has the potential to move up a few notches on this list over time. Tom Hiddleston plays a depressed musician and avid guitar collector named Adam, who is somewhere between 500 and 700 years old, and has secretly influenced the music industry over the years. His wife Eve, played by Tilda Swinton, comes to his home in Detroit to cheer him up, but unfortunately for them, her mischievous sister Ava, played by Mia Wasikowska, also finds them and wreaks a little havoc, eventually sending them on the lam. Only Lovers Left Alive is a slow, moody, and atmospheric movie that a lot of people may find totally boring, but the performances from all the actors involved really raise it up to the next level. Those actors also include John Hurt as Marlowe, who also happens to be Shakespeare's ghostwriter. Shakespeare is referred to as having been illiterate in the movie. And also includes the sadly late Anton Yelchin as Adam's human friend/supplier Ian. My top 10 begins with Let Me In, the American remake of the Swedish film Let the Right One In. Now, a lot of people prefer the Swedish film, and it actually has a higher score on IMDb. But this is one of those instances where I actually prefer the American version. I should also explain, though, that I only saw the Swedish version once, and it's been a really long time, so my memory is actually hazy a little bit on both films, actually, because it's been a while. I think that the word vampire is only used once in this film. which stars Chloe Grace Moretz as, spoiler alert, child vampire Abby. Cody Smith McPhee stars as her new friend, Richard Jenkins stars as her much older friend, and Elias Koteas stars as a cop on Abby's trail. All four performances are really solid, and I should note, however, that even though Koteas, he's a really good underrated actor who, unfortunately, despite any talent that he has or any effort that he ever puts forth in any future role, he will always be forever pointed at and called Casey Jones by any cool kid in my generation. At number 9 is the stylish Southern vampire movie Near Dark, which features a really solid cast with two particularly memorable performances from Lance Hendrickson and the late Bill Paxton. This movie was a commercial failure, mostly because the studio went bankrupt before release, so it got very little promotion. This is a movie that I actually hadn't seen until pretty recently, and it's definitely more of an experience than a lot of the other movies on this list. Story-wise, I have a few issues with the movie. I mean, there is a part where dark of night suddenly turns into bright-ass day, the effects of sunlight are uneven from scene to scene, and the ending kind of fell totally flat and honestly a little laughable. But despite all those imperfections, it still has to make it into my top 10. The tone and vibe of the movie are just incredible. From the visuals to the score, it's enough to overcome all of its flaws. But I could also see totally why someone could hate it or think it's just downright stupid. It's just one of those movies that you have to watch for yourself, and I recommend doing just that. Up next, we have the 1987 cult classic The Monster Squad. Now, there's been many movies that have featured both werewolves and vampires in them, but this is the only one that appears on both of my top 15 lists. If you'll remember, this one was on my werewolf list as well. This time it actually slides up to number 8. Since Dracula is very much in charge here, I guess you can argue that it's more of a vampire movie than a werewolf movie. And also, this is a really hot take, but I personally believe that this version of Dracula, played by Duncan Rager, is actually the best Dracula that I've seen. And yes, that includes Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee, and Gary Oldman, despite the legendary status of all three of those actors. That's right, I said it, and I won't take it back either. While Wolfman definitely has nards, Dracula definitely has fangs in this movie. Number 7 is What We Do in the Shadows. This is a fun, witty 2014 mockumentary that follows a group of vampiric flatmates in New Zealand as they prepare for the Unholy Masquerade, an annual event that mortals aren't supposed to know about, but for some reason they still have a television crew following them around and even eventually attending the event. If there's an obvious comparison to be made here, you should basically consider What We Do in the Shadows to be This Is Spinal Tap, but with vampires instead of music and with just slightly different accents. The movie was popular enough to spawn a series on FX/Hulu, which I've heard is very good, but I have not actually gotten around to watching it yet. There's lots of great moments in the movie, such as calling a flat meeting to discuss how all of the flatmates need to pull their weight. That eventually leads to one exasperated vampire yelling, "The point is, Deacon, that you haven't done the dishes in 5 years," and doesn't end before two other vampires float into the air and hiss at each other over the said dishes. It's exactly the kind of fun flick that you would expect to see coming from Jermaine Clement. At number 6, we have a second Stephen King appearance with Stephen King's The Night Flyer. The Night Flyer was released in 1998 and debuted on HBO, and is also a fun short story if you haven't read it. Not many people probably know about this movie, but it's very much a 90s movie, and there's no doubting that it has a very small budget. It was also filmed in less than 30 days, and you can kind of tell. But there's also just something about it that I love, and there's just enough good ideas here that it's a movie that I'd love to see remade today. Richard Dees is a tabloid reporter, quotation fingers, and the thing you need to know about Dees is that Dees is a dick. Literally, because his first name is Richard, and I'm sure that was intentional. Dees finds himself chasing down Dwight Renfield. That name is also not an accident. A killer who believes himself to be a vampire, and don't worry, he very much is a vampire, who travels by plane from one feeding ground to the next. All things considered, the movie does a good job in playing with the "we're not all that different, you and I" concept between Dees and Dwight. The accents are great, and the vampire itself is interesting and very unique. Seriously, its true form is only shown for just like a split few seconds, but it's an incredibly memorable few seconds that you probably won't forget if you've watched it. And if you're like most people and you haven't watched it, you can actually find it on the Internet Movie Archive, and I believe that there are a couple of versions of YouTube on here. I wish that you could find high definition copies, but unless you want to pay like $60 for a DVD, then you're probably going to be out of luck. I haven't been able to find it streaming anywhere. And we begin the top 5 with another Stephen King classic, this one from 1979, called Salem's Lot. Now, Salem's Lot would be very high on my list of Stephen King novels as well, and it would also be very high on my list of Stephen King movie adaptations. But those are 2 other lists for another day. But I just rewatched this movie a few nights ago, and holy shit, this is a long-ass movie. It's kind of easy to forget that it runs for over 3 hours, and it's also easy to forget that it was a made-for-TV special. It just feels bigger than you would expect for made-for-TV. The cast is pretty great. James Mason clearly has fun with the creepy role of Straker. David Soul, who you may know as Hutch, and his hairdo are both solid in the movie, although you do kind of wonder where the hell Starsky is through a good part of the movie. Also, Toby Hooper does a lot of things really well here visually, especially when it comes to the vampires themselves. The main vampire, Barlow, just looks absolutely legendary, and the child vampires still look as terrifying, unnatural, and dreamlike as just about anything you've seen, most likely. One of the fun things about this movie is the diverse main accents, and the fact that I can't tell if they are absolutely terrible or really freaking good. And if that isn't enough to make you want to watch this movie, this is the only place, to my knowledge, where you can see a philandering Fred Willard held at gunpoint while wearing nothing but a pair of silky maroon boxers. Damn it, Boom Boom Betty, do you have to sleep with everyone? Number 4 on my list is the 2007 Alaskan vampire thriller 30 Days of Night. If I had to pick just one vampire movie on this list that is the most badass, it would probably be this one. That's not to say it's over the top or anything. It actually isn't even all that fast-paced, and there are probably a few other vampire movies that have a little more action in them. But this one has an intense atmosphere and a simple yet brilliant concept that lends itself very well to both comics and the big screen. And the reason I say comics there is that this is based on a comic series. Essentially, a clan of vampires descend on the small Alaskan town of Barrow on the last day of summer, which means that these bloodsuckers will have a full 30 days to feed freely before the next sunrise. The feeding frenzy is brutal, and the fact that they use their victims as bait to lure out more victims and stealthily track their prey from rooftops is a great touch, as is their almost shark-like teeth, and also their unique language that they speak. There's also a few nice, subtle shout-outs to a couple of other vampire classics, with characters and names that are reminiscent to both Dracula and Salem's Lot. And number 3 is Joel Schumacher's classic, The Lost Boys. If you're struggling to remember the late 80s, or if you didn't get to experience them for yourself, then just watch this movie. It stars Jason Patric and Corey Haim as brothers who move to a new town, which is totally not Santa Clara, you guys. Stop it. Like, at all, honest. This movie is famous for many things. It was the first time Corey Haim and Corey Feldman did a movie together. It had a killer soundtrack with an unforgettable original song, Cry Little Sister. It had the shirtless saxophone meme guy. It also had Kiefer Sutherland's mean mullet. It's delicious looking Chinese food. And I could be wrong here, but I believe that this is the first and only movie where Diane Wiest played a mom. That was sarcasm, by the way. Sometimes I don't really convey that very well. Number 2 is Tom Holland's 1985 chiller Fright Night. Fright Night's just a really fun movie, and the special effects range from good to downright phenomenal, with a couple of moments being pretty much unforgettable. Basically, the story here is that teenager Charlie Brewster becomes convinced that his new neighbor Jerry is a vampire. It's a simple setup, and it's done it's a little formulaic, but it's done well. And Jerry definitely is a vampire, by the way, and he's got eyes for Charlie's girlfriend, Amy. Because people don't tend to believe vampire stories from teenage boys, Charlie desperately turns to help from his friend Evil Ed, and yes, his name was Evil Ed, and a late-night TV show host named Peter Vincent, who claims to be a world-famous vampire hunter. Vincent is actually the heart of the movie for me, and he's played terrifically by Roddy McDowall. The movie was successful enough to get a sequel, which wasn't terrible, but most view it as a boring follow-up, and also a remake in 2011 starring Colin Farrell. The remake almost made the list as well, but it does change up a lot of the story and tone, and it just isn't as fun or as memorable as the original for me. And my number 1 all-time favorite vampire movie is Buffy the Vampire Slayer from 1992. Stop laughing now. Look, I don't care if you're out laughing at me here. This movie is unapologetically one of my absolute favorite movies. It's probably in my top 25 of all movies across all genres. Almost everyone that I met on horror Twitter or in real life says that the TV show is way better than the movie. But I've never even watched the TV show, and I most likely never will, because Kristy Swanson is and forever will be the one true Buffy. And I say that as someone who actually has always liked Sarah Michelle Gellar. And yeah, my massive crush for Swanson when this movie was released definitely figures into my love for the movie. But I also legitimately think it's criminally underrated, especially when it comes to its humor. For instance, I love the new age Feely basketball coach in the movie who gathers his players around and says, "Okay, guys, let's not be so defensive out there, okay? Now, what do we say on the court? I am a person. I have a right to the ball." The cast is also really underappreciated, and I think people forget just how loaded the cast was. It includes the late Luke Perry, Donald Sutherland, Rutger Hauer, Hilary Swank, David Arquette, the first film appearance by Ben Affleck, and there's Pee Wee freaking Herman as a vampire. What more could you want? If you don't like this movie, you should have a knife thrown at your head. And that'll wrap it up for my top 15 favorite vampire movies. And I'm sure you noticed that there's really some glaring omissions here. There's not a single black and white Dracula movie, or even Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992, which barely did miss this list because I do love me some Winona Ryder. Another one that's missing, Interview with the Vampire, pretty popular with most people. For me, I used to like it, but now it's one of those that just comes off as too much, "Hey, come see how good I look." As always, be sure to drop a like and subscribe, and let me know what you thought of the video in the comments section.